In this video lecture, we're going to go through 3 different types of research questions that we analyze in the field of political science. So the first kind of question we're looking at is a causal question. And this kind of causal question asks, what caused why, or what caused an outcome? So this question will look at what are the causes for some sort of outcome, focusing on a small number of cases. So let's take an example here. Why is violence really high in Honduras? They have among the highest rates of homicide in the entire world. But then next door in neighboring Nicaragua, rates of violence are fairly typical for a Latin American country. So what explains this difference? You have 2 countries with similar levels of development, similar locations in Central America, similar histories in that both countries had civil wars and a violent history in the 1980s. And yet you have really different outcomes here. Right? So for this, you're looking at what are maybe multiple causes that would explain this difference, but just focusing on a couple of cases, not trying to say, well, what explains violence in all countries in the world, but for these cases, and what are maybe multiple factors that are going on here. And here, for this kind of question, these sort of causal questions that look at the roots of some sort of outcome, the focus is on tracing out those causal processes, trying to assess what the most important factors are involved, maybe what lots of different causes are, and how they work together to lead to different outcomes. So that's the first kind of question that we look at. The second kind of question is also a causal question, but it's framed differently. And so for this question, you look at, well, what's the effect of some sort of cause on an outcome? What's the effect of X on Y? Here, we're looking at the precise impact of one cause that we're isolating on an outcome, but for lots of cases. So you might take that similar interest you have in violence in Central America and say, well, what impact does having been victimized, having yourself been robbed or assaulted, or having a family member be assaulted or robbed, what effect does that have on rates of political participation? So maybe you think that people who have been victimized by crime are more likely to participate in rallies and protests. They're more likely to be involved in some sort of form of political participation as a way of demanding a response. So here you're not looking at the impact that being victimized had on just a few cases. You want to look at how overall the impact that victimization would have. And here the focus is on making sense of broad patterns and pinpointing the causal effect of one particular cause. So not looking at why does somebody participate politically and looking at all the different factors that go into that, but instead saying, no, what effect does crime victimization have on this outcome? So it's another kind of causal question, but with a different focus. And the third kind of question is an interpretive question, which is looking more at the processes of meaning making. So interpretive questions are not causal questions. Instead, they look at meaning making for a small number of cases. So I will note here that this is a much smaller branch of political science, but it's still an interesting and important branch. So if you're interested in this issue of high rates of crime in Central America, you might turn around and say, well, how do people define citizenship in areas of high violence? So if you are a mother who has experienced violence, how does that shape the ways that you even think about what it means to be a citizen in your country? Does that change your understanding of the state? Does it change your understanding of what democracy means for you? Here, the question is not looking at broad patterns, but it's looking more at some of the fuzzy areas that we all know are part of politics and trying to make sense of these shifting ideas behind it. So instead of looking for these causal relationships of saying here is a cause and here's the outcome, instead you're trying to say, well, what does even this outcome of, say, citizenship even mean? What are the shifting ideas? What are the understandings? And the idea here is that sometimes the world is not actually patterned in the same way, and that before we can start even thinking about causal questions, we need to think about what meaning really is. So those are the three types of questions that we explore in political science.